The lawyer hadn't even finished the sentence before my aunt reached over and squeezed my cousin Darla's hand. That's the image I keep coming back to, not the words. Not my own name, conspicuously absent from every line item read aloud in that beige conference room. It's that hand squeeze, the private little celebration that wasn't even private. My aunt, my grandfather's daughter, sitting 3 seats down from me at a table in a law office in suburban Ohio, already exchanging victory glances with her daughter before the attorney had turned the second page. I noticed because I was watching for it. I've been watching for it for years. My name is Renata. I'm 31 years old, and I had spent most of my adult life being the family member that people forgot to fully include. Not dramatically, not with shouting or obvious cruelty. It was more like static. Like someone had turned my frequency down just low enough that most conversations happened slightly over my head. Most decisions were made without a call to me. Most holiday photos put me at the edge of the frame. I want you to understand this before I tell you about the will, because what happened in that room didn't happen in isolation. It was the conclusion of something that had been building for a very long time. And my grandfather, a man named Harold, who wore the same cardigan every Sunday and made terrible coffee and could recite baseball statistics from 1962 with more accuracy than he could remember our birthdays. My grandfather had been watching too, quietly, the way he did everything. He died in February. Lung cancer, diagnosed late, progressed fast. 11 weeks from diagnosis to the last Sunday in his chair. He was 79 years old and he spent his last weeks being very calm about the whole thing, which was more unsettling to me than anything else because I didn't know what to do with a person who wasn't panicking. He kept saying things like, I've had time to get my affairs in order, and I would nod and try not to cry in front of him because he found visible grief exhausting. The last real conversation I had with him was 3 weeks before he died. We were alone in his kitchen. He was making that terrible coffee, moving slowly, and I was sitting at the table the way I had since I was a child. He said without turning around, You know that attorney of mine, Bramblett? I said yes. He said, I'm having him come by next Tuesday, finalizing everything. Then he poured 2 cups and sat down and we talked about the weather and a book he'd been trying to finish. He never mentioned the will again. I didn't either. I think a part of me didn't want to know. Because knowing meant having a number attached to whatever I was worth to him, and I was terrified of that number. My family had spent years suggesting, in gentle and not so gentle ways, that Grandpa Harold was more fond of me in theory than in practice. That I was his charity case grandchild, the one he felt responsible for because my mother, his youngest daughter, had died when I was 12, leaving me technically in the care of an extended family that never quite knew where to put me. Darla used to say, when we were teenagers and she thought I was out of earshot, that her mom had basically raised me. This was not true. Her mom had let me live in their house for 14 months when I was 13, during which time I slept in a finished basement that wasn't heated and ate dinner after everyone else had already cleared their plates. But Darla believed it, or chose to believe it, and it became the story that explained our dynamic. They had done me a great favor. I owed something, and any inheritance I might receive was, by that logic, already theirs, a correction to an imbalance, a repayment of a debt I had been told I owed since I was a grieving 12-year-old with nowhere else to go. I had a different read on it, but I'd mostly stopped arguing. The will reading was scheduled for a Thursday afternoon in March, 6 weeks after the funeral. I drove 2 hours to get there. I wore a dark blazer and I stopped at a gas station on the way and ate a granola bar in my car and told myself it didn't matter what was in that document. I told myself I wasn't attached to an outcome. I practiced saying this in the rearview mirror, actually practicing it, like a line I was going to have to deliver convincingly in front of an audience. The conference room at Bramblett and Associates was small and smelled faintly of old paper and the kind of air freshener that tries too hard. There was a long oval table, 6 chairs, a window that looked out over a parking lot. I arrived early. So did Darla and my Aunt Patricia, who I had not spoken to substantively in about 2 years, not since a Thanksgiving that ended with Patricia saying some things about my mother that I will not repeat here, but that I have also never forgotten. Then came my Uncle Curtis, who was Harold's son and the only member of the family I had ever genuinely liked. Curtis was quiet and straightforward and had a habit of finding me at family events and just sitting near me without requiring anything from me, which I had always found deeply decent. He nodded at me when he came in and sat in the chair directly across from me, and I was grateful for it. Then came Darla's brother, my cousin Marcus, who I saw maybe twice a year and who I had no particular feelings about either way, and his wife Shannon, who I had met 3 times total. And finally, there was my Aunt Patricia's boyfriend of several years, a man named Don, who had absolutely no legal reason to be present, but who Patricia had brought anyway, possibly as a witness, possibly as emotional support, possibly just because she went everywhere with Don. Nobody challenged his presence. Mr. Bramblett came in last, set a thick folder on the table, and thanked everyone for coming. He was older than I expected, round glasses, the kind of slow and deliberate voice that makes you feel like every word has been legally vetted before it leaves his mouth. He said the standard things, that Harold had been a clear-minded and methodical man who had revised his estate documents multiple times over the years, most recently the prior autumn. Then he opened the folder. I watched him read. I watched the room listen. My Aunt Patricia was sitting very still with her hands folded on the table. Darla had a legal pad in front of her, which struck me as presumptuous, the kind of thing you bring when you expect to be taking notes about what you're receiving. Marcus was on his phone until his wife touched his arm. Curtis was watching Mr. Bramblett with the careful, neutral expression of someone who already knew most of what was coming. The house went to Curtis. This was expected. It was the house Harold had lived in for 40 years, and it made sense. And Curtis received this information with a single nod and nothing else. Various accounts and investments were divided, with detailed allocations to Patricia, Curtis, Marcus, and Darla. These were significant amounts. I don't want to say exact numbers because I don't think they're the point, but they were significant. I watched Patricia's composure loosen slightly into something that looked like relief, and Darla actually wrote something on her legal pad, and Marcus finally put his phone away. And then Mr. Bramblett turned a page and kept reading, and my name was not there. He turned another page. Still nothing. I knew, rationally, that I was not a blood relation to Harold. Technically, he was my mother's father, which made him my maternal grandfather, which meant I was a grandchild by blood. But there had always been a running conversation in this family about what that meant in practice, about whether I really counted. Patricia had said at various points over the years that Harold felt an obligation to me, but that obligation had been fulfilled when I was raised to adulthood, that I couldn't expect to be treated the same as the biological grandchildren, that my mother's portion of any estate had died with my mother. She had said these things in the careful language of someone preparing a legal argument. I had always suspected she had also said them repeatedly to Harold. When the attorney finished the first document, he set it down and removed his glasses and looked at the room and said, "That concludes the primary instrument of Mr. Harold's estate." And I sat there with my hands in my lap and I kept my face completely neutral, which took everything I had because Darla was already glancing at her mother with the very beginning of a satisfied smile, and Patricia was sitting straighter, and the whole room had shifted into a quiet kind of completion that excluded me. Curtis was looking directly at me from across the table. Mr. Bramblett said, however, the room stilled. Mr. Bramblett. Harold included an additional document in his estate materials, which he specifically instructed was not to be presented until the primary will had been read in its entirety and all parties had had a moment to absorb its contents. He reached into his briefcase. He placed a white envelope on the table. It was addressed in my grandfather's handwriting to me. My full name in his cramped and slanted print across the front of a standard business envelope that had been sealed with tape as well as the gummed flap. The extra tape being the most Harold thing I had ever seen in my life, because he taped everything, absolutely everything, boxes and packages and the mailbox lid that kept blowing open, always suspicious of anything that relied solely on adhesive. The room was very quiet. Patricia made a small sound that was not quite a word. Mr. Bramblett said, "Miss Renata, I've been instructed to read this aloud in your presence with all parties attending, per Mr. Harold's explicit request." I said, "Okay." My voice came out steadier than I expected. He opened the envelope, unfolded 2 sheets of paper, put his glasses back on, and he began to read. The letter started simply with Renata. If you're hearing this, it means Bramblett followed my instructions, which means he earned his fee. Somebody at the table let out a surprised breath that wasn't quite a laugh. The letter continued, and I'm going to tell you what was in it as accurately as I can because I have read it dozens of times since then, and I have most of it close to memorized. My grandfather wrote that he had thought very carefully about what to put in his primary will and what to put in this letter, and that he had decided to separate them deliberately. He wrote that he was aware of the conversations that had happened in his family over the years about my place in it, and that he was also aware that some of those conversations had involved suggestions that he reduce or eliminate my share in order to be fair to his direct family. He wrote this word in quotation marks, which Mr. Bramblett rendered faithfully, pausing slightly to communicate the punctuation. He wrote that he had listened to these suggestions politely and had made his own decisions. He wrote that he had known my mother, his daughter Clara, since she was born, and that he had loved her imperfectly and lost her too soon, and that I was the most direct extension of her that remained on earth, and that anyone who wanted him to feel otherwise had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of what a family was. He wrote that he had watched me, for years, quietly absorb the way this family treated me, and that he had not said enough in those moments, and that this letter was partly his attempt to say it now instead. Patricia's composure broke somewhere around this paragraph. Not into tears, Patricia didn't do vulnerability in public, but into a rigid, white-knuckled stillness that was its own form of fracture. Then he wrote about the financial arrangements. And this is where I need to explain something that I had not understood until that moment. Sitting in that beige conference room with the parking lot outside and my grandfather's voice coming through a 70-year-old attorney reading his letter aloud. My grandfather had not put me in the primary will. He had done this deliberately, on advice from Bramblett, who he had apparently worked with for 30 years, because he had anticipated, with the precision of a man who had observed his family very closely for a very long time, that if my name appeared in the primary will, it would be contested. He'd watched enough family dynamics play out to know that his wishes regarding me would be challenged, argued over, pulled apart by people who would frame it as concern for fairness, but who were in fact concerned over money. He had structured his estate specifically to minimize the surface area for that fight. What he had done instead was establish, over the course of several years, a separate legal vehicle, a trust, not a testamentary bequest, something that had already transferred legally and irrevocably before he died, before the will was read, before anyone could contest anything. The trust had been funded incrementally, quietly, in amounts that didn't trigger reporting thresholds or family conversations. It was managed by Bramblett's office. It had my name on it, and its terms were, according to my grandfather's letter, specifically designed so that it could not be challenged by beneficiaries of the primary estate. He wrote, near the end of the letter, "The amount in the trust is not a consolation. It is not a charity. It is what I decided you deserved, free of interference. If it seems like more than you expected, that is because it is more than they would have let me give you if they had known about it." Mr. Bramblett reached into the briefcase again and produced a second document, this one describing the trust in legal terms. He did not read the full amount aloud. He set it in front of me and told me, quietly, that we could speak privately after the meeting concluded. I looked down at the number. I don't think I visibly reacted. I hope I didn't. I pressed my fingertips against the edge of the table, and I breathed very carefully, and I thought about my grandfather in his kitchen, making bad coffee, telling me he'd had time to get his affairs in order. He had said it so calmly. I understand now why. The room had changed. It was a physical thing. The change in that room, like the pressure dropping before a storm. Patricia was very still. Darla was no longer looking at anyone. Marcus was staring at the table. Curtis across from me was watching my face, and when I finally looked up and met his eyes, he did a very small thing. He nodded, once, with an expression that said he knew and had known and had kept the secret and was glad it was out. He was the only one who had been told. He told me this later in the parking lot, while Patricia sat in her car with Dawn and Darla stood by the curb on her phone. Curtis had known for about a year. Harold had told him because he trusted him and because he wanted someone in the family who would support me after this moment. And because, in Harold's words, Curtis had the sense to understand the difference between fairness and mathematics. "Did you ever almost say anything?" I asked him. "Every Christmas," he said. But he asked me not to, so I didn't. We stood in that parking lot for a while. The air was cold and there was still patchy snow on the curbs. I kept thinking I was going to feel something enormous, some dramatic outpouring that matched the size of what had just happened. But mostly I felt the specific tiredness that comes from having held something tightly for a long time and then being allowed to set it down. I also kept thinking about my Aunt Patricia's face when she realized, I want to be honest about this. I am not proud of how satisfying I found that moment. I'm not proud of it, but I'm also not going to pretend it wasn't there. I am a human person who spent most of my childhood eating dinner after everyone else had cleared their plates. And if I got 3 seconds of satisfaction from watching the woman who orchestrated that arrangement realize that she had been operating on incomplete information for years, well, I'm going to let myself have that. Let me back up and tell you who Harold actually was, because I realize I've described him mostly in relation to this moment, and he was more than this moment. Harold James Keegan was born in 1944 in a small town in western Pennsylvania that no longer exists as its own municipality. He was the son of a steelworker and a woman who taught piano lessons to the neighborhood children. He left at 17 to join the army, came back 2 years later, met my grandmother at a church dance, married her within the year, and proceeded to spend the next 4 decades building a life that was quiet and specific and almost aggressively unfancy. He worked for a regional utility company for 32 years. He coached Little League for 12 of them. He made the same breakfast every Saturday morning: eggs and toast and a grapefruit cut in half, which he ate with a small serrated spoon that I have now inherited along with some other kitchen items, and which I use every time I eat a grapefruit because it makes me feel like he's still being practical at me from the kitchen. He was not a sentimental man in the obvious ways. He didn't say "I love you" without prompting, and he was deeply suspicious of anything he called emoting, which was a word he used disparagingly to describe most things on television after about 1987. But he showed up. That was his language. He drove an hour and a half to see me in a school play where I played a tree. He kept a photo of me on his refrigerator my entire adult life. When I went through a bad year at 24, lost my job, had to move. The kind of year where everything you thought you'd built turns out to be construction paper. He called me every Sunday morning at 9 o'clock for 4 months, and he never told me it was going to be okay, but he also never stopped calling. He knew, I think, that I didn't need to be told things were going to be okay. He knew I needed someone to keep calling. After my mother died, I lived in that basement of Patricia's for 14 months before Harold arranged for me to move in with a family friend instead. A woman named Ruth Ann, who had 3 kids of her own and who remarkably treated me like a fourth rather than a complication. I have always assumed, until the reading of that letter, that this move had been a family decision, some coordinated response to a difficult situation. The letter told me otherwise. Harold wrote that he had moved me because he visited twice, and both times he'd found me eating alone in a kitchen after everyone else was done, and both times he'd watched Patricia fuss around him as a host and pretend everything was fine, and on the drive home the second time he had pulled over on the interstate on ramp and sat in his car for several minutes because he didn't know what else to do with how he felt, and he needed a moment before he could drive safely. He had arranged Ruth Ann himself. He had called in a favor, and he had driven me there with 2 garbage bags of my belongings and 1 plastic bin, and he had sat at Ruth Ann's kitchen table for an hour while I got settled, and then he had come and hugged me goodbye, which he almost never did, and he had said, "You'll be better here." He was right. I don't think I ever fully knew how much he had been paying attention. He wasn't good at expressing it. He was 79 years old, and he'd grown up in the kind of household where feelings were the thing you did after everything more practical was handled, and mostly he ran out of time for feelings. But he'd been watching. He'd been watching for years. He just expressed it the way he expressed everything else, by making a plan and following it through. The trust, as it turned out, had been established 11 years prior. 11 years. He had started it when I was 20, which is around the time I stopped fighting with Patricia and just went quiet, which is also around the time I think he decided that the family dynamic was not going to correct itself and that he would have to work around it rather than through it. 11 years. Small amounts every year. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would register as significant on its own. Just consistent, patient, quiet intention. The number was enough to change things for me. Genuinely change them. I had been renting a 1-bedroom apartment for 6 years, driving a car that I fixed myself because I couldn't afford to take it to a mechanic, working a job I didn't dislike but didn't love, living the kind of life where the margin for error is very thin and the thing you're saving for keeps getting pushed back. I had been okay. I wasn't suffering, but I had been okay in the way that feels like treading water. Fine as long as you keep moving, but exhausting, and with no promise of reaching shore. The trust meant shore. I left the law office without talking to Patricia or Darla. I stopped to squeeze Curtis's arm in the parking lot and tell him I'd call him. And then I got in my car and I sat there for a long time with the heat running and the document in my lap. And I thought about my grandfather pulling over on an interstate on ramp because he didn't know what else to do with how he felt. I thought about him making bad coffee. I thought about the extra tape on the envelope. I drove home. It took me about 40 minutes longer than it should have because I had to pull over once, and then again for reasons that had nothing to do with traffic. I stopped at a rest area and sat in the parking lot with the engine off, and I called my friend Mara, who had known me for 12 years and who had been through most of the hard parts with me, and I said, "Something happened today that I don't know how to explain yet." And she said, "Are you okay?" And I said, Yeah, I actually think I am." And there was something in my voice that must have been new or different, because she was quiet for a moment, and then she said quietly, "Good." Then I drove home. I want to tell you about the days after because the story doesn't end in that conference room. Or it does, in one sense. The formal part ended there. But what happened afterward was its own chapter. Patricia called me the next evening. I had expected this. I had, in fact, been mentally preparing for it since the parking lot. I let it ring twice before I answered. She said, immediately, I want you to know that I'm not calling to contest anything. I want to be clear about that up front. I said, okay. She said, I just want to understand what Dad was thinking. I said I had some sense of it based on the letter. She said, he could have just, if he wanted to give you more, he could have said something. I don't understand why it had to be like this. And here is where I had a choice, because I understood exactly why it had to be like this. And she understood exactly why it had to be like this. And we both knew that we both understood. The question was whether I was going to walk us through it anyway, whether I was going to itemize for her all the conversations she'd had with him over the years, all the pressure she'd applied, all the ways she had categorized me as something lesser, so that a smaller inheritance for me would seem like justice rather than cruelty. I didn't. I said, I think he trusted Bramblett's advice on the structure. Patricia was quiet. Then she said, I want you to know that I always thought of you as family. This was, objectively, one of the most remarkable things anyone has ever said to me. I sat with it for a moment, and I thought about the basement and the cold and the dinners alone and the Thanksgiving and 20 years of being managed and minimized, and I said, I know that you did in your way, which was true. She had in her way. The way was just very small. She said, I hope this doesn't have to change things between us. I said, I don't think things need to change. And then I got off the phone and I sat in my apartment and I thought about how little I wanted a relationship with her and how little I was obligated to have one. And I thought about how my grandfather had given me, among other things, the financial security to simply not need things that were bad for me. That was the gift inside the gift. And I don't think he planned it consciously, but I think he might have understood it. Darla texted me 3 days later. She said, hey, hope you're doing well. I know things have been complicated. Let me know if you ever want to get coffee. I read this text several times. I thought about what it meant. The hey, the complicated, the let me know. The way it was casual enough to have been sent to anyone, generic enough to not require her to say anything she actually felt, vague enough to preserve deniability about what kind of outreach it even was. I thought about the legal pad she brought to the will reading. I thought about her squeezing her mother's hand before my name didn't appear. I didn't respond. I'm not proud of this either, but I'm also not ashamed of it. There is a version of this story where I am gracious and generous and extend the olive branch and begin rebuilding things, and I think that version is very admirable. I also think it's not the version I was going to be able to live in, at least not then, maybe not ever. Some things, once you've sat with them long enough, just settle into the shape they're going to be. I had been carrying the idea of Darla as family for 30 years because she was technically family, but she had never, in all that time, actually chosen to be mine. And choosing not to respond to her text felt, for the first time in a long time, like something I was allowed to do. Marcus, I have no particular feelings about, and I think he has no particular feelings about me, and we will probably see each other at family events that I will continue to attend because of Curtis, and we will be cordial, and that will be all it is. Curtis I have spoken to every 2 or 3 weeks since the will reading. We had dinner last month, just the two of us, at a restaurant he chose because he knew I liked Italian food, which he had learned at Thanksgiving 2 years ago and apparently filed away. We talked about Harold for a long time. He told me stories I hadn't heard. I told him a few things I'd never said to anyone about what those early years had been like. We both had more wine than was probably practical for a Tuesday, and at the end of it, we hugged in the parking lot, and he said he would have liked knowing you two were doing this, meaning Harold, and I said, I know, and I meant it completely. The grapefruit spoon is on my kitchen counter. There is a specific kind of grief that comes with realizing a person loved you more than they were able to say, and that they expressed it in forms you might not have recognized as love at the time. A phone call every Sunday, a move arranged quietly, 11 years of consistent, patient, secret intention. I spent a lot of years wondering if I belonged in that family, wondering if the distance I felt was something I had earned, something inherent to who I was, or just the natural result of a strange situation with no clean solution. The family hadn't adopted me. They hadn't rejected me. They had just held me at a particular temperature for a very long time, warm enough that I couldn't call it cold, but never quite warm enough to feel at home. Harold was the exception. I see that now with a clarity I couldn't have had before that room, before that letter, before that extra piece of tape on a white business envelope addressed to me in his cramped and slanted handwriting. He wasn't good at saying it. He was a man of a generation and a temperament that didn't traffic in declarations. But he had been watching. He had been paying attention. He had pulled over on an interstate on-ramp because he couldn't drive safely with what he felt. He had spent 11 years building something quietly so that no one could take it apart. That's love, I think. The kind that doesn't announce itself. The kind that makes a plan and follows through. The kind that puts tape on the envelope just to be sure. I use the grapefruit spoon most mornings now. I don't know if he knew I would. I think he might have hoped.